I'm a polar bear. I don't get on with hot places. I tend to wilt in the sun.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure, a podcast looking at unfamiliar places across the world and aspects of travelling you may never have thought of. I'm your host, the Barefoot Backpacker, a middle-aged Denbigh with a passion for offbeat travel, history, culture and the whys behind travel itself. So join with me as we venture beyond the brochure. Hello! In my last episode, I commented that the weather was getting more spring-like. Well, on the one hand, as I record this pod, we've just had 2 days of very summery weather. On the other, well, the 2 weeks in between pods have been largely back-to-back autumnal conditions with rain, hail and gale-force winds. What joy. My friend Debbie visited me last week. This is the lady you'll recall I used to live with in Sheffield, but who now lives in Guernsey. We didn't do a lot, but I did show her my local mall, and we also went to the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, which I don't recall ever having been to before, which is weirdly a miss for me. It's built on the site of the world's second oldest dedicated passenger railway terminus, which might be the nichest claim to fame in the whole podcast. You might wonder about the oldest. It's 33 miles away and is now a small park. But that's a tale for another episode. If I sound slightly off in this episode, by the way, it's because on Tuesday afternoon I had the roots of a tooth extracted by the dentist. Well, 2 teeth. They'd kind of fused together in some way, so it was easier to extract them both rather than leaving one of them in situ. I'd been meaning to do it for ages. It's been low-key irking me for several months, but I hadn't quite got used to them being gone yet. No, it didn't hurt. Huzzah for local anaesthetic! But it has taken a little bit of a while to heal up. With regards to my comedy side hustle, I've been keyed in to take part in what I believe is called the Comedy Sex Therapy Stand-Up Session at a venue in Manchester on Sunday afternoon, but quite what that means, I don't know. A couple of the other people on the course I did have also done it and said it was a great laugh. Apparently there's a sex therapist in the audience who comments on things after we do the routine. Quite what they want with a sex-averse Arrowace NB, I don't know. I'm sure it'll all make sense when I'm there. My medication's still working. You might be able to tell. As you probably know, my first trip outside the UK was to Denmark for a week when I'd just turned 11. I don't remember a lot about that trip, though a lot of photos do exist. What I do remember, though, was that my uncle bought a guidebook especially for the trip. It didn't just cover Denmark, though, it covered the whole of Scandinavia. Young me was very keen on maps and encyclopedias anyway, and this, a whole book that encompassed both and more besides about a different part of the world that I knew not much about. Listener, I lapped that thing up, constantly reading it before and after the trip. I don't remember who published that guidebook, only that it was red with a plastic cover that contained a map, and I believe it had a picture of a polar bear on it. But I do recall the section on Spitsbergen, a mythical island group in the far north with a huge warning in the box at the bottom of one of the pages, saying, more or less, beware of polar bears, take a gun. The impression the guidebook gave is that there were polar bears everywhere and nowhere was considered safe. This was probably not what was written, but by the time of my second read-through, I'd already formed that impression. Naturally, this imprinted itself on young me's brain, and ever since then, I'd had a low-key fascination for the place. Of course, I never imagined I'd ever go, because why would I, and what would I even do there? Even as a theoretical grown-up, it was never high on my list, in part because it was Norway, and why would I take what I perceived to be a really expensive journey in what was already a really expensive country? I'd go to Norway one day, and I'd probably just take a day or two in Oslo or Bergen, and that would be all. Maybe when I retired, I'd do a fjord cruise. Last year, I turned 50. Laura's task was for me to have visited 100 countries by then. And Norway was the last country in Europe I'd never visited, the last independent sovereign state anyway. I've never been to the Faroe Islands, nor a couple of the dubious entries over in the Caucasus. I sat down and had a look at the potential journeys, and on a whim I wondered how much it would cost to fly up to the islands, now more commonly known as Svalbard. If I felt I'd likely only visit Norway once, and I knew that at the time of my trip I was likely to at least be able to afford it, even if it were a special treat, I ought to consider the possibility of visiting, at least. The answer turned out to be far less than I imagined. It was also easier to visit than I imagined. At that point, my planned long weekend to Norway suddenly became a 10-day jaunt. The timing of my journey was more or less fixed, less a little finessing as to the order. It seemed easier and cheaper to go there last. This also meant I'd be there just as the midnight sun was ending, a curious moment, I felt. And although I didn't choose and finalise everything until I got there, I had a spreadsheet plotting out potential side trips and tours. I felt like I wanted to do something on land and at sea. Maybe I'd even see a walrus. It all seemed pretty easy to do. I'd even get to visit a brewery. 11-year-old me would be impressed. I want to start by giving a quick overview of the history of Svalbard and give an indication of what and where it is. It's probably somewhere you've glanced over on a map and gone, what on earth is that? If so, you wouldn't be the first. The islands lie roughly between 76 and 81 degrees north. For comparison, the northernmost point of Alaska is only 71.2. The main town on the islands, Longyearbyen, at just above 78 degrees north, is the most northerly settlement in the world with a population above 1,000. And in fact, it is the second most northerly civilian settlement in the world. The related settlement of Ny-Ålesund, population varies around 100, is around 70 miles or 110 kilometres northwest. Everybody further north than this is either military or scientific. Despite its location just north of Norway, it seems Svalbard was too far north and too far remote even for the Vikings to have made much use of it. Indeed, there is a debate as to whether they even went there at all. There's also suggestion that the Pomors, or northern Russians, may have used it for hunting. However, evidence for any use is pretty sketchy until 1596, when the Dutch explorer William Barents, he who the Barents Sea is named after, an early polar explorer seeking a northeast passage to China, definitively noted it and first named it. In the years immediately afterwards, the islands were used mainly for walrus hunting, and as the land basis to secure fishing and whaling rights, which were argued over between the English, the Dutch and the French. And let's face it, who else would it have been? The land itself, though, was barely touched, save by the Pomors, and the occasional German, who used it mainly for fur trapping and seal hunting. The Norwegians didn't arrive until the very end of the 18th century, again mainly as hunters rather than settlers. The first use for Svalbard as anything other than a hunting spot or polar exploration stopover only came at the end of the 19th century, when the extent of its coal reserves became clear. At this point, there was almost a Wild West-style coal rush, as various companies backed by European governments sought to establish themselves on the islands: Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, the UK, Germany and Russia, amongst others. Even the USA all had operations on the island, and the place had the feel of a series of independent company towns rather than a single entity or state. Indeed, at this point legally, the islands were terra nullius, or land not controlled by any government. The main town on the archipelago, Longyearbyen, means Long Year's Town, and is named after American timberland and coal mine developer John Munro Longyear, who previously operated mainly in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He founded the city in 1906 as a mining town to develop the local coal fields. A combination of the need for regulation of the mining industry and World War I saw Norway formally request control of the islands. This was granted in 1920 by virtue of the Svalbard Treaty, and came into effect in 1925 after some more finessing, although the international nature of the islands meant two important provisions to Norwegian control. Firstly, that the island should be a free state with regards to industry, customs, settlement and employment, and secondly, that they should remain politically neutral and free from military and defence use. The latter occasionally became a flashpoint in Norwegian-Soviet relations, especially after Norway joined NATO in 1949, and explains why the first commercial airport on the islands didn't open till 1975. However, both provisions are still in force, and I'll talk about that a little more shortly. Over the course of the 20th century, most of the other nations pulled out for economic reasons, because, it's up there in the Arctic Ocean and it's hideously expensive to get there, get back and, operate, leaving only the Norwegians and the Russians having any kind of presence on the island, because, Norway is just there and Russia is just over there. Each kept themselves separate, the Russians having mainly Barentsburg and Pyramiden, the Norwegians having mainly Longyearbyen and Ny-Ålesund. However, by the end of the 20th century, even the Russians had mostly left, maintaining a couple of hundred workers in Barentsburg. Pyramiden was abandoned in 1998, largely as a result of a plane crash in August 1996, when a charter plane servicing the settlements hit the 960-metre tall Oprafjellet mountain to the east of Longyearbyen and killing 141 people. I just, at this point, want to make a quick note about the name. Like many places, Holland versus Netherlands, England versus Britain versus UK, Australia versus Mordor, there's a lot of confusion about the names used for the area. When I was growing up, the word that seems most common was Spitsbergen, as per the guidebook. But these days, most people I come across seem to refer to it as Svalbard. The tourist board uses it, and all the admin is listed as it. So that's the name I've been using across this pod and my other social media. I just assumed it was some kind of name or transliteration change, similar to how Peking became Beijing. But no, it's a more formal demarcation than that. The name Spitsbergen comes from the Dutch for pointed mountains, because from a distance that's pretty much all William Barents could see. And the word was applied to the whole of the island group. There was probably no need to differentiate one individual island from another if all you were really doing there was whaling or setting up camp for a few months and trapping some seals. It wasn't until 1925 when Norway, having taken control, decided to rename the whole archipelago as Svalbard, a modern name derived from two older Norse words that together mean something along the lines of cold edge, or, apparently, and this is very Viking coded, cold beard. The name Spitsbergen was then relegated to that of the main island, which had previously been called West Spitsbergen. The Svalbard archipelago as a whole consists of over 400 islands, islets, rocks and skerries, but only 6 are larger than 200 square kilometres, or twice as big as Disney World, and given the island of Spitsbergen itself covers 59% of Svalbard's total area, and since pretty much both 100% of the people living on Svalbard and 100% of the tourists visiting Svalbard only ever go to Spitsbergen Island, the semantic difference has kind of been lost over the last 100 years. So, while Svalbard is nominally an integral part of Norway, there are a series of regulations that mean it has a special status external to some of Norway's rules. This is all, of course, because of the Svalbard Treaty in 1920, but the effects are that, for instance, it's not part of EFTA and it's not part of the Schengen area, and this allows any citizen to visit, live and work on Svalbard regardless of nationality or visa status. As a slight caveat to this, it's only really possible to access Svalbard directly from 2 countries, Norway and Russia, both of which do have visa restrictions for many citizens. So while you may not need a visa to visit Svalbard, you may need a visa to get there. Unless you want to sail a ship through Arctic waters, I guess, you wouldn't be the first. 2 other aspects that this creates is that the visitor might notice is that it means you get stamped out of Norway when you fly there, and back in when you fly back, and it means that prices are cheaper than you might expect. The treaty specified that tax raised can only be used to fund Svalbard itself and not go to the Norwegian government as a whole. Consequently, there's no VAT, and income tax is only around 10%. What this does mean in practice, though, is that the population of Svalbard is quite different from the population of the mainland. The islands have a population that bounces around 3,000, of which only just over 60% are Norwegian. Russians make up maybe around 10%, mainly centred in Barentsburg and handling the residual administration of Pyramiden, and the remainder are a variety of nations, including, curiously, a small but significant population from Thailand. There's more Thai restaurants in Longyearbyen than in my local town of Soby Bridge. The population on Svalbard is also very seasonal, catering to the science and tourism industries. While, unlike, say, the average British seaside resort, the tourist season is more or less year-round, though the main bursts are during the weeks of the midnight sun and the polar night. My visit in mid-August was very heading towards the shoulder season. People working in the industry tend to come for maybe 6 to 9 months and then leave, and I'll talk a bit about that later when I talk about ethics of travel. The lady who ran the brewery overview was French and said she was only here for 9 months, heading back home in the October. The other thing to note about Svalbard is its population density distribution. Svalbard has a total area of just over 62,000 square kilometres. Longyearbyen has a population of just under 2,600. 90% of the entire population of Svalbard live in one town, which covers an area of 10 square kilometres. Barentsburg, pretty much the only other population centre, has just under 300 people and is of negligible size. Both of these two and the abandoned Pyramiden lie in a small area around Isfjorden and related waterways. Ny-Ålesund is some distance north, but is a mere scattering of buildings that's home to often fewer than 40 people. This means that over 60,000 square kilometres of Svalbard, about the size of West Virginia, or somewhere between Croatia and Latvia, is completely uninhabited. I mean, to be fair, it's effectively uninhabitable, given it's mountainous, cold, difficult to access, and barren. Unless you're a polar bear, I guess. If people, on Instagram especially, know anything about Svalbard, it's the polar bears. The road sign telling people to beware of them is almost a meme. It's certainly one of the most common selfie spots on the island, and the supermarket sells t-shirts with it on. I bought one. In case you haven't seen it, the sign is a red triangle warning sign with the silhouette of a polar bear, and underneath is a placard that says Jelle Jelle Svalbard, which more or less translates as applies to the whole of Svalbard. Essentially, it makes Longyearbyen an enclosed community. The law states that you're not allowed to pass any instance of the sign unless you're in a vehicle with a gun, or you have a gun, or you have a guide with a gun, and a vehicle. Coming from somewhere with incredibly strict regulations on pretty much any kind of weapon, never mind gun ownership, it's quite a culture shock to know that pretty much everyone you meet is either armed, or, given the size of Longyearbyen, could be within a handful of minutes. But to be fair, it is with good reason. I don't know how much you know about polar bears, but they're big buggers. Females are considerably smaller than males, but consider that the average female is around 190 centimetres in length, 6'3", the same as my height, and you'll have seen of how tall I am, and weighs of 200 kilograms, or twice as much as I do. You don't want to meet an angry male. Indeed, on average, the polar bear is the largest land carnivore by body mass. Much smaller than the likes of an elephant or a rhino, but honestly, who's counting? They generally travel at around 5.5 kilometres an hour, or slightly quicker than an average human, but can run at 40 kilometres an hour and swim at 6 kilometres an hour. So they're bigger than you, a better runner than you, a better swimmer than you, and there are no trees in the Arctic. Do you feel lucky, punk? The chances of running into a polar bear are very small. I didn't see one on my hike, which is just as well, because if I had, it would have been very close. But I also didn't see any from the boat trip when I was scouring the land on high zoom. And there were peninsulas and ridges with no settlements and very little in the way of human activity where polar bear are free to roam without interruption. But that doesn't mean they're zero. And if you see a polar bear when you're on your adventures, you absolutely need some protection. Otherwise, your chances are low. They do sometimes appear in town, usually driven by a basic need for food. A little while ago, one person was killed and another suffered severe injuries when a polar bear struck on the ridge above the church. The injuries were caused when she ran down the sheer slope to escape. And there have been reported attacks at the campsite near the airport. While it's annoying not to be able to venture too far, and indeed not be able to reach the airport under your own steam, those regulations, those signs, are incredibly important for everybody's safety. The guns, by the way, would only be used on the bears as a very last resort. They are an endangered, vulnerable species, and harm should only be done in a literal life or death situation. The main use of the guns is rather to create as much of a noise and disturbance as possible, to either scare them off, or at least make them feel there are easier meals to be had elsewhere. There is other life on and around Svalbard, and it's no less spectacular. The most visible is, of course, birds, at least during the summer months. Svalbard is a birder's paradise as tens of thousands of birds make their homes in the many cliffs, and around 240 species have been spotted on the islands. There are only about 45 regular visitors, and only one, the Svalbard ptarmigan, stays year-round. The most commonly spotted include the northern fulmar, the puffin, the Arctic skua, the Arctic tern, which gets basically everywhere in the world, and even, apparently, a songbird, the snow bunting. At the time of my visit, it was at the very end of the birding season, and the flocks were heading south to warmer climates, even if that, for the likes of the pink-footed goose, only means the UK, leading to the weird concept of flying to the UK for winter sun. In the streets of Longyearbyen, it's also not unusual to see reindeer. The open spaces between buildings provide great space for the reindeer to roam freely and hide, as much as they can anyway, in the shrubbery. And I feel it's important to talk a bit about the environment of Longyearbyen here. It's small in terms of population, but it's also small in terms of physical presence, which feels odd to think about when you're in it. One thing about the town is that it's widely dispersed. It's a lot bigger in area than you think it should be, in the sense that when you're looking at somewhere you want to go, you'll think, oh, it's just over there. But when you start walking, you realise, oh, it's actually further than I thought. This is largely because, although there's only basically 3 main roads in the town going east, west and south, and a few dead ends and a few small estates off them, this isn't a town that uses every available space. I mean, I have to say, it's got 2,600 people and it covers an area of 10 square kilometres. It's hard to find a realistic comparison for population density for that, as most places aren't uniformly dense, but it's somewhere between Nigeria and Luxembourg, or slightly less populationally dense than Maryland, which is quite low for a significant urban centre. There are large gaps in the middle of the town. Buildings, mainly 3-storey housing blocks of bright if understated colours, stand by the road, but between the roads a lot of the space is barren, flat scree. A small river runs through the town, and even in the centre it feels quite wild. The pebble sides and the sharp grassy verge is reminiscent of moorland Scottish streams feeding lochs. It's very open. There's a lot of emptiness here. Even in the centre of town you don't feel hemmed in at all. Indeed, the main streets with the shops and the cafes and the supermarket, that there are buildings on both sides of the street strikes you as slightly odd. You can sense that nature is here, it's all around, and the town is just incidental. This is even more apparent when you stand on one of the many surrounding hillsides and look down. Even though in town the buildings feel like they loom, from up there they seem no bigger than toy houses that you could just pick up and throw. The surrounding landscape is so absolutely huge and vast that you realise this really is a small town, a village even, in the middle of nowhere, and if it absolutely wanted to, nature could crush it with nary a breath. It's quite a weird feeling. And this nature is pretty unrelenting. It's steep slopes to ridges, mountain peaks and glaciers. It's a carpet of scree stones and the occasional tuft of grass. It's bleak and unforgiving of humans. There are no trees on Svalbard. There are no bushes. There's barely any vegetation at all. Everything is grey, shades lighter or darker depending on sunlight and ice cover. The glaciers feel immense until you look at the rest of the bare slopes and realise they too are just trifles in a land of custard. You could be 5 kilometres out of town and feel like you're 500 kilometres away. This, the vastness and inaccessibility of the island, and the lack of the people outside the area around the main fjord, and of course the polar bears, is why there are only 3 roads on the island, and they all end only a few kilometres outside of Longyearbyen. One goes east, maybe 5 kilometres to an old mine above Adventdalen. One goes west for about 4 kilometres to the airport and then peters out long before Barentsburg. And the other that heads south barely even reaches the edge of the town before it merges with the scree at the foot of Sarkophagen. There's nowhere else for them to go, and no easy routing for them to get there anyway.
Longyearbyen was a really interesting place. It was just the way this tiny little settlement combined science and mining and tourism and the logistics of living somewhere so cold and dark, or at least in the winter. If the heating system breaks down, you basically have to evacuate the whole island because when it breaks down, it freezes. And then you've got to rebuild the whole thing basically from scratch. So every life there just feels so precarious.
That was my friend Julie, who blogs under the moniker I Am a Polar Bear, talking about Longyearbyen. And since, if you visit Svalbard, most of the time you're going to be in and around Longyearbyen, I ought to talk a bit about what there is to see and do there. A lot of the time, a visit to Svalbard means being on a tour of some kind. Tours in Svalbard obviously vary by season. Winter brings sleigh rides, ice cave adventures and the Northern Lights, while summer trips include mountain hiking, boat trips and wildlife spotting. There's no real bad season to visit, though of course you may need to plan your visit to coincide with what you want to see and do. Don't expect to see aurora-lit skies in May or go birdwatching in November. There's of course all year-round adventures to be had, including mine tours, overviews of the town itself and fossil hunting, or just spend an evening in a traditional wooden hut in front of a fire and listen to local people talk about the life and history of the place. Most of the tours will offer pick-up and drop-off at either your local accommodation, if it's a known hotel, at the Radisson Blu Hotel, which serves as the centre of the town where most of the other people will be, or at the airport, making it really convenient. Even the water-based trips, which go from the port a little way west of town, will provide pick-ups. This means you don't really need your own motorised transport at all, an important consideration for visiting sustainably, which I'll talk about in depth later. I'll also talk about how I spent my time in Longyearbyen, including a little about the 2 trips I did near the end of the episode. But back to town. Immediately on leaving the airport, there are 2 notable tourist photo opportunities, and one inside if you count the polar bear. Stuffed, of course. One is an example of the famous polar bear sign mentioned earlier. The other is a signpost with distances to many places in the world, including the North Pole, 1309 kilometres, feels almost walkable. The South Pole, 18,692 kilometres, absolutely not, and several of the world's most notable cities, like London, Moscow, Bangkok and New York, which is slightly closer than Beijing. It also gives directions to a couple of hamlets on the island itself, though not to Longyearbyen town centre, which at 110 Norwegian kroner, or about $11, is an expensive 4-kilometre shuttle bus ride away, though if you're worried about costs, you wouldn't be travelling to Svalbard. This bus meets every flight and on return drops off a couple of hours before every flight leaves, so the timetable is dependent on the flights and isn't exactly fixed, But you're absolutely not going to be stranded. The airport's small enough that if you have luggage, it won't take long to get to the terminal. And even if it does, you can just pop out to the bus and go, I'm just waiting for my bags. When flying out, by the way, the airport has a decent enough shop and a couple of places to buy food. On a hill overlooking the airport is the famous Seed Vault. Essentially, it's Earth's backup system. It's an underground vault. There's about 4 rooms. Each of them is about 300 metres squared. That's pretty much got all of the seeds for a lot of the agriculture for the world. It's used as a storage system so that if something goes extinct or we destroy it, because we're humans and we do that sort of thing, we have a backup copy in the seed vault that we can just duplicate, clone and repopulate that part of the world with. We've actually done this. During the Syrian civil war, there was a plant that was effectively eradicated, and then after the civil war ended, they went to the seed vault, got a copy of it, or a clone of it, or one of the seeds there, and then repopulated it in Syria. The reason it's in Svalbard is because of its remoteness and its climate. Of all the places in the world, it's the one that's least likely to be affected by, well, pretty much anything. It's quite deep down, and you can't go inside, so all you see is 2 sheds. I think here, though, the important thing is to be there. See where it is, and think about how something that looks so innocuous could be so important. Longyearbyen town centre has 2 museums. One of them is the North Pole Exploration Museum, which I didn't visit because the reviews suggested it was very similar to the other polar museums I'd been to on this trip, including one in Tromsø and the Fram Museum in Oslo. But if you don't visit either and just go straight to Svalbard, definitely visit this one. It covers the polar explorations that took place in and around Svalbard and a bit about the fur trappers too who based themselves here. At some point, I will do a podcast episode about polar exploration and bring in Antarctica as well, because there's a whole series of interesting stories. I would love to have put it in this one, but this episode is already 13,500 words. Anyway, the other museum is the Svalbard Museum, which looks at Svalbard as a whole. The sections on its history, on why people have been here, not just the traders and the explorers, but also the miners and the speculators, and why Svalbard has some of the specific and unique laws and culture that it does. It also shows the culture of the island, its wildlife, its resources, and a bit about its future. Another museum is mine number 3. As I've mentioned, Svalbard is populated largely because of coal mines. Although they're all closed now, or at least all of the Norwegian ones, one of the 7 or so that operated in the vicinity of Longyearbyen is still in use as a museum. It wasn't a large mine. The coal seam mine wasn't more than 90 centimetres thick, and it was pretty much only in operation during the 1970s and 1980s. It was also what's known as a drift mine. Essentially, it was one you walked into rather than took a lift down to, meaning working conditions were somewhat less onerous and presumably safer than the typical deep mines. Still a dark, messy, dirty job, though. Anyway, these days you can follow in the miners' footsteps, see the equipment they used, and even clamber a bit through a replica tunnel to get a feel for how they worked. Obviously, you can only visit on a tour. And not just because it's in polar bear territory beyond the town. After a hard day's work, you're going to need a beer. And Longyearbyen is home to the world's most northerly brewery, Svalbard Brewery. It's been producing beer since 2015 and has looked as expanding into the distillery market too. They make around 11 beers as standard, including a pale, a couple of IPAs, a stout, a bock and a Weiss beer, but over half their sales are of the Pilsner. They also make a selection of occasional limited edition beers, celebrating some aspect of Svalbard history and culture. They're also the main supplier of sparkling water to local shops and businesses. In fact, they're also the main backup supplier for water supply in general on the island. Note that a lot of their water comes from glaciers, which gives the resulting beer a somewhat unique taste. Now, the brewery was only founded in 2015, because until then it was illegal to produce alcohol on the islands. Svalbard has strict laws about alcohol that date back to the law on Svalbard in 1928. In those days, the majority of Svalbard's population was young, male and working in mining and related industries. The need for a sober population in a key and dangerous industry, coupled with the ever-present threat of polar bears, meant that alcohol had to be restricted as much as possible, so that you weren't drunk on duty. While alcohol itself wasn't banned, access to it was tightly controlled. All alcohol had to be imported, could only be sold in specific places, and people would only be allowed to buy a certain amount per month. Indeed, the latter law is still in place. Residents and visitors are limited to a monthly quota from the one and only shop licensed to sell alcohol, which is up to 2 bottles of spirits or 4.5 bottles of strong fortified wine, 24 cans of bottles of beer, and apparently unlimited wine each month. Priorities. Residents have a beer card that gets stamped, while visitors need to show their plane tickets. These quotas do not apply to pubs and restaurants, for the record, which makes for a very lively pub scene. The law on alcohol production, however, was rescinded in 2015, largely thanks to the campaigning of one man. Robert Johansson, mine worker and pilot, realised the demographics of Svalbard had changed. It was now largely families and students, and that the island's total beer consumption was around 400 to 450,000 litres per year, all of which had to be imported. He figured it would be better for society, the economy, and the environment if beer was allowed to be made on Svalbard, and in 2009 started the process of challenging the law. The government proved surprisingly open to the idea, but progress was too slow for Robert's liking, so he called up the office responsible to check on progress. Every month. The whole process took nearly 5.5 years before permission was granted, and the law changed. So yes, that's a lot of phone calls. Indeed, they got to know each other really well, so well in fact that the government team themselves had an invite to the official opening. The brewery is one of the furthest things away from the town centre that you're still allowed to walk to. It's at the harbour where the boat tours go from. The two museums are pretty much at the centre of the town, at the junction where the three roads meet. Just along the south road from the junction is what passes as the High Street, where the supermarket, the local shops and a couple of the cafes and restaurants are. It's also home to a statue commemorating its mining heritage. The supermarket itself, it's called the Co-op, though it's not a co-op as we'd know it in the UK, is quite large and sells almost everything. On one side of it is a section selling clothes, tourist souvenirs and some electrical white goods, while the other is entirely food and drink, mostly at reasonable prices too. One interesting thing I noted was that only locals are allowed to use the self-service machines. Tourists have to use the staffed checkouts. I'm assuming this is for quota and tax reasons. Many of the other spots in Longyearbyen are interesting in passing, including a lovely little sundial on one of the ridges that instead of having a plane to indicate the time, it has a small polar bear. There's also an old graveyard. One of the many things that people know about Svalbard is that it's illegal to die there. In fact, that's not true. Although it's clear if you're close to the end of life, they do like to put you on the first available plane to Tromsø. Indeed, there's no real elderly care industry here at all. I don't think there's a retirement home even, so people tend to retire back to the mainland of Norway before it becomes an issue. But rather, it's now illegal to be buried here. The permafrost is so hard and the climate so generally cold that it's almost impossible to dig a grave deep enough that will allow the body to decompose, and the thawing and refreezing of the surface has a tendency to regurgitate what's underneath. And of course, they're not going to throw your body into the sea or feed it to polar bears for ethical reasons. The other issue is that not only do you not decompose, but nor does any pathogen or bacteria that may have caused your death. Locals were particularly worried when people who died in the 1918 flu epidemic and buried in the graveyard were examined in the 1990s and were found to potentially still contain a live virus. It is apparently possible to be cremated, but the admin this requires is too onerous to make it worthwhile. Near both the graveyard and the sundial is a small church, Church of Norway, Evangelical Lutheran. It is the world's most northern civilian church. There's a Russian Orthodox church at an airbase in Franz Josef Land, the next archipelago to the east, and the church there is about 2 degrees further north. It was built in 1958 to replace an older church burned during World War II. It's made with wooden panels, is red with a conical tower with a longer blue-grey admin section to the side, and serves not just as a church, but as a kind of communal meeting place. It's open 24/7, it's not large, seating space is reported to be 140 people, but it is very bright and airy inside. The main section is up a flight of stairs, and part of it is a dedicated cafe space with a shop selling local crafts that runs on an honesty box type system. There's also a polar bear inside. Again, stuffed, which is as near to one as you want to get, let's be real. On my visit, people were using it as a place to read and do some work. The downstairs reception area has toilets and a place you can put your shoes. And that is one interesting quirk of Svalbard culture. In certain parts of the world, establishments from shops to bars have signs that say no shirt, no shoes, no service. Given the climate, where even in the height of summer, average daily mean temperatures are only 7 degrees Celsius, it may surprise you to know the culture is somewhat different in Svalbard. I mean, obviously shirts are de rigueur. You could walk around topless, but unless you're a fan of Newcastle United Football Club, you'd quickly see the error of your ways. But shoes? That's a different issue, and one the barefoot backpacker can quite get behind. In many places, shoes are banned. In some shops, many buildings, restaurants, and the Svalbard Museum even, when you enter, there's a place where you can hang up your coat and either a gym changing room-like bench or a bookshelf-looking cabinet where you store your shoes. You take them off just like your jacket, leave them by the entrance, it's secure, plus also in Svalbard, nothing's going to happen to them. and then wander around in just your socks, or even barefoot if you're wearing sandals, though I never saw anyone do this because this is Svalbard, and even in August the temperature was in the high single-figure Celsius. I was wearing socks. Anyway, it's all perfectly normal, and indeed expected. There's several regions of the world like this. I recall having to take my sandals off before going to a travel agent in Philippines, for example. And of course, most non-Christian religious sites enforce this kind of regulation. However, in almost all of them, the reason is now primarily cultural, in a symbolic or spiritual way. In Svalbard, it's a culture that stems from a living memory practicality. The town was built on coal mining, and all the mines were close to the centre. Miners would traipse around the town after shifts on the way home, and obviously they would be covered in coal dust, especially their boots. So by ensuring every building was a shoes-off environment, they could keep their buildings clean. One of the reasons people come to Svalbard is to experience the midnight sun. My trip was in late August and coincided with the end of 24-hour daylight. The sun set on my last night there at around 12:30 a.m, which was the first sunset since around the 18th of April. Admittedly, it was only below the horizon for an hour and a bit, and you honestly couldn't tell. Civil twilight and a largely grey, light, cloudy sky makes for not a lot of change in ambience. But it was a signpost of the oncoming winter. The sun went down 2 months later, on or around the 26th of October, and didn't rise again till the 15th of February. The midnight sun is... I lived in Glasgow for 2 years and hiked on Orkney in midsummer, and even there, it got properly dark for sure, but never for very long. And when it's pretty much daylight at both 11 p.m. and 3 a.m, that definitely messes with your sleep patterns regardless of how dark it actually gets in between, especially for a night owl like me. Obviously, the midnight sun is that but the final step, and I went outside to see it. And it's a little weird to be in daylight in an otherwise empty and quiet town. It's a bit like it was during the pandemic. They do cope with it well. In the Airbnb I was in, the curtains were such that I didn't notice the daylight, although being at the back of an apartment with a view mostly on the side of an embankment probably helped. I didn't visit during the polar night. That would make for a somewhat different experience, as Julie notes.
I do like to go up to the north, and when I went to Svalbard, which was November 2015, I was actually looking for somewhere in North Norway. I just wanted a few days of, playing in the snow, dog sledding, snowshoeing, trying to see the northern lights and failing. Somewhere like Alta or Hammerfest, somewhere up north. But the flights were complicated, they were expensive, it just wasn't working. So on a whim, I looked at flights to Svalbard, and they were cheaper than flights to mainland North Norway. It was the complete opposite of everything that I'd ever heard or expected. It was what they called dark winter when I arrived, so the sun had set about 3 weeks earlier, but it hadn't properly started snowing. So we did a dog sledding trip, and as soon as the dogs were unleashed, the sled just ran aground on the gravel that was hiding just underneath it. And my poor sled mate Sarah, who was the passenger, got off to push us free, and of course without her weight, the thing took off, with me clinging to the back, fully expecting to be thrown off it and smash my skull open on the rocks, and Sarah to be lost in the dark and eaten by a polar bear. You expect dog sledding to be serene and beautiful, and it's not. It's really hard work, and it's terrifying, and also it stinks. And I also did a snowmobile trip, where I expected all the time to roll the thing and die, because yes, I spent a lot of time expecting to die, but it was really good fun. But maybe it's more fun in daylight, and maybe when you're not gradually realising you may not be able to outrun a polar bear on it. We did a Northern Lights trip and saw absolutely nothing, but they were out the afternoon that I went snowmobiling, and I missed them because I was warming up by lying on the bathroom floor because it had underfloor heating, which was amazing. I did a guided minibus tour of Longyearbyen, and one evening I walked up to the public pool, which is about 5 metres deep, a lot deeper than I expected, and that was great, and it was especially great because my hair froze on the way back.
It is possible, though apparently more difficult than you might expect, to see the Northern Lights in Svalbard. Geographically speaking, it's a little too far north. The best places are within about 3 degrees of latitude either side of the Arctic Circle, which, in this area, covers Iceland and Tromsø. Indeed, Tromsø is, and always has been, very much a gateway to Svalbard and the Arctic polar regions in general. And as I say, I will hopefully do an episode on polar explorations one day that will cover it in more detail. I only spent 1 full day there, but it feels like quite a fascinating city. Hello! It's time for a mid-episode break. Half-time, 7th inning stretch, that sort of thing. Put the kettle on, grab a snack, get comfortable. I'm just here to remind you ways in which you can get in touch and help this podcast out. You probably know this already, but in case you don't, the best way of supporting this podcast is to join my Patreon. For as little as a pint of beer at Wetherspoons every month, you can get a shout-out on this podcast, get occasional exclusive content, and other benefits. This podcast is going places, and wouldn't you want to say you were there before it was cool? The Patreon link can be found at patreon.com/traveltalesbeyondbrochurepod, and it's also in the show notes. The second best way is to appear on the pod yourself. If you sign up to my newsletter, you'll be able to see what episodes are being planned and see which you'd like to contribute a voice recording for. It's also a great way to keep in contact if and when the social medias undergo a lingering heat death. Newsletters should come out in the first week of each month, and sign-ups can be found at barefoot-backpacker.us14.list-manage.com/subscribe. There's another link in the show notes, in case that was a bit wordy. I'm a big fan of promoting fellow content creators and podcasters. If you've got a podcast or vlog trailer you'd like to hear featured in this spot, drop it to me and get yourself heard around the world. Now, on with the show. There is a serious side to visiting somewhere like Svalbard, however, and now it's time to talk a bit about ethical travel and tourism. As I'm sure you know already, Svalbard's in one of the regions of the world most affected by climate change. According to official temperatures recorded at the airport in Longyearbyen, in the period between 2015 and 2023, the average January temperature rose by 8 degrees Celsius. In addition, in June 2023, the average temperature hit over 10 degrees Celsius for the first time, 10.1 to be precise, which is above the cutoff for defining what an Arctic-type climate is. Meanwhile, in the north end of the archipelago, Karl XII Island, 80.66 degree north, very polar, has seen an average temperature increase of 2.7 degrees Celsius per decade since 1981. Temperatures are rising here, and rising fast. This increase isn't just because Svalbard itself is getting warmer. Svalbard is located at the extreme northern end of the Gulf Stream, the current and wind that blows warmer air and sea northeast from Mexico. This water is also warmer than it used to be, by about 1.5 degrees Celsius since 1950. Both effects are combining to affect the sea ice and glaciers on and around Svalbard, with both local and global consequences. With regards to glaciers specifically, they're currently believed to cover 34,000 square kilometres of Svalbard, or around 55% of its area. This will halve by 2100. It's calculated, in fact, that 8 gigatons of glacier ice melts every year. The more the climate warms, the more will melt. On a local level, this has significant effects on wildlife. Traditional fish species are moving north to follow the cold and are being replaced by more southerly species. This impacts both sea life in general, as the balance is broken, but also feeding patterns for larger wildlife who may not be able to adapt to new fish. A more obvious issue, though, is the lack of sea ice means less room for larger creatures like polar bears and walruses, who use the sea ice to sleep, breed and hunt. This combination of reduction of living area and hunting grounds leads to increased fighting for resources, malnutrition, and an increased likelihood of using land, bringing them into more conflicts with local human populations. Climate change also affects land flora and fauna too. Terrestrial life is adapted to harsh conditions and will be forced out if the default vegetation changes and new fauna come that the native species aren't able to compete against or cope with. This invasive species could also bring new diseases that further eradicate the native species and change the balance of nature. One might argue, given such a situation, whether it's right to visit Svalbard at all. Don't worry, they ponder the same question. Svalbard has been designated a, quote, sustainable destination, unquote, since 2022, and they're very proud of it. They were very irked when they lost that designation in 2019. This is a designation created by Innovation Norway, a government agency, and means anyone given it has a commitment to focus on sustainability and aims to improve efforts related to sustainability as an everyday measure. That doesn't mean, of course, that Svalbard itself is sustainable as a tourist destination. Even Visit Svalbard acknowledge the dichotomy of being a popular destination in such a precarious environment. Rather, it means that always being open to the questions posed by sustainability and environmentalism and seeing where they can reduce their impact. More importantly, it means making decisions that could favour the environment over the tourist krona. And this despite tourism as a whole, especially since the mines closed, being ranked alongside scientific research as one of the most important industries. Quite how important isn't clear given how recently the mines did close, so many of the stat indicators haven't caught up yet, but it should become apparent how important tourism is in the coming years. One issue that is definitely known, though, is cruise ships. We all know how polluting cruising can be. The problem is, it is quite an important industry for Svalbard on its own. Cruise tourism alone is estimated to account for 50% of the tourism to Svalbard and 9% of Svalbard's total economic activity. And those stats are from 2024, so it will only get bigger. So it's a large amount of money to completely disregard. Their compromise has been to limit by statute the size of the cruise ships that visit quite substantially. I believe none larger than 200 people can visit. I don't know if there's a limit on the number of ships. I haven't been able to find that out. In addition, Housekeeping and Svalbard, one of the main maritime tourist companies, use hybrid electric boats and are looking into renewable power. Proclamations of the death of the age of sail are maybe premature. The idea being, if they're going to have to do this, they're aiming to do this with as little of impact as they can. Despite this, there is another ethical factor involved. It must be remembered Longyearbyens' population is 2,600. The town is not big enough for the cruise ships, no matter how small they're mandated to be. When they rock up, the town gets swarmed, everything gets bought out, and then they leave. There's not enough resource in the town to handle such a large influx of people for such a short time. This is why one of the main guidelines issued by the Svalbard Tourist Board is for people to stay a while, rather than just use it as a flying visit for the fjords and ice, and therefore spread demand for services and resources over days rather than hours. I'll talk about the rest of their guidelines shortly. Obviously, the only other way of getting there is flying, which has its own well-documented issues. To mitigate this, flights to Svalbard have an added 150 Norwegian kroner, about $15, added for the Svalbard Environmental Protection Fund, whose purpose is to, quote, conserve and protect the rich national environment and cultural heritage on the Svalbard Islands, unquote. It also helps that there's only one international airport, so if necessary the number of arriving flights could even be controlled more strictly than it is. Another concern is around citizen science tourism. This is where tourists tag along on mostly scientific expeditions. Tourists like these types of trips as they feel they're involved and doing something good, but the scientists by and large hate them. There's also a vibe of greenwashing with such trips, especially as there's a sense they don't really need to happen, and that the benefits to tourists are outweighed by the lower quantity and quality of scientific value and the very fact that there's a big ship sailing through the fjords at all, which causes environmental hazards that such cruises are designed to show the malefits of. As an aside, you might wonder what the local population's view of tourists is. My visit was too short to delve deeper into whether there's any animosity between locals, as in people who live there full time, and tourists or seasonal workers, but I did find the results of a survey conducted in 2022, published in 2024, had 238 respondents that skewed slightly towards Norwegian residents rather than immigrants, that strove to answer some related questions around this. The biggest takeaways were that tourism wasn't seen as a bad thing for Svalbard, but locals thought there was too much tourism, specifically in the summer, and they did wonder whether tourists took to heart the environmental strategies of the islands. One of the highest scores of agreement, that's mean scores between 1 and 5, was for tourism degrades nature at 4.47, and a 4.3 score was, in answer to the question, there is too much tourism in the summer. Overall, on the survey, not against tourism per se, and they indeed acknowledge its importance, they just feel that what they have is slightly too much. There's also a belief and willingness that tourism can improve the tourist perceptions of wildlife and environmental concerns by visiting, but a feeling that in real life, very few of them actually do. Local businesses are also acting sustainably in other ways. Svalbard Brewery, for example, is very self-sufficient. They burn their production waste. There's too much for local producers to use. Dumping it in landfill in this environment would be disastrous. And while they did look to export it, that would involve increasing the number of cargo ships serving the islands. By burning it, though, they generate energy to power the brewery, and also heat water they use in the brewing process, thus making themselves largely self-sufficient, at least in terms of energy use. They do export their beers to Norway's mainland, but only on the normal supply vessels that operate the route and serve the islands as standard procedure rather than on specific contracted transport. Hurtigruten and Svalbard use electric snowmobiles for their land-based tours, being one of the first organisations in the world to do so. I'm not sure how big the market for electric snowmobiles is, but when you're on the front line of climate change, everything helps. And the islands as a whole have a target to produce their entire energy supply through renewable means by 2030. Its sole coal-fired, what else, power station closed in 2023, and production was switched to diesel generators in the interim. The main supermarket installed solar panels, and these meet upwards of half their energy uses, at least in the summer months. Other innovations include battery storage, useful when solar energy production is so variable across the year, and wind turbines. Another aspect of ethical tourism is the age-old mantra, eat local, shop local. However, in Svalbard, there's a couple of contrasting issues on this score. So, for instance, I ate whale and seal while I was there. Partly this is all about sustainability, and report after report have highlighted that while Norway has strict minke whale hunting quotas that it seems to stick to, and the minke whale itself is not considered endangered as a result, it is true that Norway is one of the few countries that still hunts whales and is often criticised for it. Meanwhile, seal hunting is a much more grey area, with less regulation and much less understanding on how many seals there actually are. The last large-scale seal population survey being undertaken seemingly nearly 25 years ago. Climate change hasn't helped tracking of this, and is also likely to have pushed numbers down. With regards to fish, Norway is very protective of its fishing grounds, which means there's at least less scope for overfishing through other countries. They keep having arguments with the European Union about it, but quite how much fishing Norway is doing on its own is unclear. They do sometimes instigate bans on certain fish for several years in order to allow stocks to replenish, but it's certainly believed by many that they are catching more than they're allowed to. It seems part of this is a rule in Norway that if you catch it, you keep it. There's no discarding of unwanted, undersized or undermarketable fish back into the ocean. And that's as far as I'm going, because I might be many things and the pills might allow me to focus more effectively, but you know what, I'm not interested in fish. There's probably another podcast out there for that. However, the problem with eating local on Svalbard is, well, the fact that nothing grows in this godforsaken forlorn place, so an arable-based agriculture is just, well, no. A small number of greenhouses do exist, but in the main, if you can't hunt it or catch it, you have to import it. And everyone living on Svalbard has the right to hunt, albeit with quotas, of course. Remember too, the climate requires fat. And what are whale and seal? Fat. So eating locally hunted meat, regardless of the ethics of it, is more sustainable and environmentally friendly than having a vegetable pizza. Remember too that before coal, Svalbard was only visited, and only by local populations, because of its fishing and hunting grounds. So it's similar in cultural practice to the islands of northern Canada. Maybe. Jury's still out on that. As an aside, you might be interested to know what whale and seal taste like. To me, whale was a bit like venison, quite a gamey meat, decent flavour. My seal steak had the texture of a slightly firm but still quite spongy chocolate cake, and tasted a bit like pork. Would definitely have again. Although unlikely, unless I visit Svalbard again, let's be honest. One final aspect about sustainability that I feel is important to note is the relative transience of the population in general terms. It's estimated that of the 2,600 people in Longyearbyen, around 1,700 were Norwegian and just under 900 weren't. That's an immigrant rate of 33%. This ignores the remainder of Svalbard's population, chiefly the 297 in Barentsburg, who are going to be pretty much all Russian, and again are likely contracted workers rather than permanent residents. As I say, many of the foreigners stay for only about 7 or 8 months in one session, covering at least one of the tourist seasons. But transience isn't just limited to the immigrant population. According to Statistics Norway, the average time people live on Svalbard for, across all nationalities, is 7 years. It's very much a place to come and work in rather than make a long-term life on. Not only is there no elderly care on the islands, there's no maternity hospital either, and little provision for illness of many kinds, so life itself can demand an end to your time here regardless of your intent. This lack of permanence and the resulting frequent population shift not only adds to the transportation effects of climate change, but also means there's a lot more need to push environmental issues here. There's no mileage in such thoughts like make it a place you want to grow old in and do it for your children, so there's potentially less latent incentive to do the right thing. So how can we visit Svalbard ethically? Well, the local tourist organisation Visit Svalbard tried to ensure tourists do this and willingly and openly provide assistance and advice. They do assume, though, that people coming here are ethical in the first place. Their website says, quote, increasingly more tourists are demanding and choosing destinations that demonstrate responsibility and that offer genuine and authentic experiences of high quality. We want to give you information about how you can experience the archipelago with a good conscience, unquote. Although in fairness, it's the sort of place you'd only visit if you already had that in mind. It's not a place on everybody's bucket list, and it is not the place that you would go to if you wanted Benidorm. Their tips for ethical tourism are: A. To make a visit for several days. That means to ensure that you're not just here to do one thing, or that you're just using Longyearbyen as a one-night stopover while you wait for an Arctic cruise. Spend time here, explore, have a variety of experiences. B. Choose to visit places with or tour with a company that has an environmental certification. And they provide a comprehensive list of them. They also advise always using local companies and services rather than ones or agents based in your home country. And of course buying local products and eat local food rather than imported goods. C. Travel outside the peak season. While there's two main, almost unique reasons to visit Svalbard, the polar night and the midnight sun, it is the latter that is far more popular, and especially the period mid-May to mid-August. But of course with lengthy days, or nights if that's what you prefer, most activities are available for a much longer period and indeed might be less crowded. Certainly on my visit in later August, it felt quieter than it could have been, and I was the only person on one of my booked tours. D. Don't only use motorised transport. Use kayaks, dog sledding, skiing or hiking. You also don't need to go too far to find spectacular activities. Even hiking to a glacier is possible from the centre of Longyearbyen. To be fair, it's not a place you'd really need to hire a car in, but even so, it's relatively easy to keep your urban movements unmotorised. E. Don't pick the flowers. Indeed, Longyearbyen has issued a whole list of guidelines for how they want guests to act. In some places, this might be seen as interference, but here, I think it's probably not just wise, but obligatory to police tourists in some way. And most of it is common sense anyway. And these include things like don't approach the wildlife. It's a polar bear. Don't disturb the dogs. Ask people before photographing them. Don't touch historical sites or cultural relics. And, importantly, make sure you dispose of rubbish correctly. The taking of tours is quite fundamental, as Svalbard isn't exactly a destination for independent travel, because, polar bears, and an extreme climate and topography, and a lack of infrastructure, resources, and, let's face it, pretty much anything outside Longyearbyen. The Visit Svalbard website has a full list of tours and tour companies orderable by many options including style, date, length and price. And you can book tours directly through it. All tour companies available are licensed and authorised by Visit Svalbard, and they'll only put forward trips that meet strict ethical criteria. This isn't just about environmental and animal welfare issues either, including husky rides and wildlife cruises, but also political ones. For example, Pyramiden is a very popular place for tourists to go, but Visit Svalbard had stated that due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they aren't currently advertising any on their website, and while they say it's still possible to visit on a tour, most of the tour companies who work with Visit Svalbard have also removed the options from their brochures, which was a bummer, as I really wanted to see the world's most northerly Lenin statue. So, how did I visit Svalbard? What did I do? And did I visit ethically? Well, I spent 3 nights in Longyearbyen, which coincided with the very end of the midnight sun, as you know. You can use this as a framework to plan your own trips. Or don't. I don't care. I'm not your travel agent. I landed at 1:30 p.m. on a 2-hour flight from Tromsø, itself an interesting town to learn about polar history and life, and waited around for my first tour to pick me up from the airport. This was kind of an orientation and overview tour around Longyearbyen with a company called Longyearbyen Guiding. Scheduled to take 3 hours, but it turns out I was the only person on the tour that day, so it took considerably less than that. It cost 1,000 kroner, and it takes you to, outside, many of the most important sites in the town and local area, while a local guide tells you all about the history of the town and the importance of the places you see, including the Seed Vault, one of the mines overlooking Adventdalen, and around the town to the church, the sundial and the graveyard. My guide was a chap who moved to Svalbard when he was 4, and so spent a lot of his life here. Though he had moved away as an adult for about 20 years, he returned in the last few years, so he's seen the place change quite a lot over that time. One of those ways is the industry. Back in the 90s, his job was to drive buses for the miners to reach the out-of-town mines. Can't do that anymore because they've all closed down. The tour dropped me off at my accommodation, which was an Airbnb not far from the Radisson Blu Hotel. After checking in, dumping my backpack and having a bit of a rest, it was time to go out and explore the nightlife. By nightlife, I meant the pub. On Fridays, the Svalbard Brewery opens its brew tap, and though there's several restaurants and bars in town, being at the brewery means this is a great place to sample more of their beers directly. It's not a large room, but it's quite open plan, so you're going to be sat at a table with other people. That makes it a great place to socialise and meet people. And these people could be locals, they could be other visitors, or they could be some of the many seasonal staff who come over to work in the local businesses or the tourist industries. It just feels a little more like a genuine community place to meet up. My second day was spent on one of the hiking tours. There's many to choose from, but I went for one up Sarkophagen, mid-level hike on all criteria that starts at the southern edge of town. It's close enough to the town centre to be accessible, but equally, once you're out of town, it's remote country regardless of where you go, so you're not losing much by going further anyway. There were around 12 to 15 people on my tour, including a couple of children, tween age, so you shouldn't feel like Svalbard isn't a destination for family holidays. There are no beaches. The hike itself wasn't very long, maybe no more than 5k, but it felt a lot further and a lot harder than that because of the terrain, more or less bare rock, and when you're hiking up them, they're quite stony and pebbly, scree, narrow, and sometimes quite precarious and sheer. At one point on the way back, I came down on my bottom because it was just easier and safer for dyspraxic me. It's not the easiest place to hike if you're not used to that sort of terrain, and you definitely need walking boots. This is not a place for barefoot hiking, even if the weather was warmer. But it was definitely worth it. The trail took us past the edge of a glacier and then along a ridge that ended in a sharp point with great views over the town and surrounding hills. We even saw someone running with a gun, because on our visit there was a ultramarathon race, sort of like a midnight to midnight, which was over the 5 hills around the town. And because it was the midnight sun, it was daylight all the time. It's one heck of an epic race. Ultramarathoners, it's on your list. There are tours you can take that go over the glaciers that supply crampons and other specialist equipment. I didn't feel that was the sort of hike for me, but I imagined that would be really spectacular. In the evening, I went back to the brewery for another event, which I mentioned earlier. It's described on the website as a brewing tour, but in reality most of the brewing equipment is visible from the main bar room anyway, and it's more of a tour of the beers they make. You get a flight of 5 of their beers and you're told a bit of information about each. In between samples, they give a brief overview of the brewery and its history, and also the history of alcohol of Svalbard in general. The room was pretty much full on my visit, so that's about, 40 to 50 people? The brewery also sells merch, so I got a t-shirt. I visited wearing my t-shirt from Falkland Brewery, one of the most southerly in the world, so it seemed fitting to buy one from the most northerly. On the Sunday, I did one of the boat tours. It was called Wildlife and Glacier, on a hybrid catamaran, a large cruise ship type vessel, and the tour had well over 100 people on it, so it was a big change compared to the other tours and places I'd been. It sails up Billefjorden, which is the fjord that runs north opposite Longyearbyen. It's about 19 kilometres long. It travels all the way to the glacier front at Skjoldbreen, which is 48 kilometres from Longyearbyen, more or less, and for much of the journey you run alongside remote steep ridges. Disappointingly, didn't see a polar bear on the rocks, nor any walrus. If you do this trip, though, take a pair of binoculars, as the whole area is great for birds and sea creatures. The Russian town of Pyramiden is on Billefjorden, and although we didn't go into it, we passed it slowly and could make it out in the gloom and the mist. It looked quite a forlorn and austere place, a lot of grey, in an environment mainly made up of grey, with grey skies, which I guess was quite on brand for a Soviet-era Arctic town. And no, at that distance, I still couldn't make out the Lenin statue. Skjoldbreen is a huge, huge wall of ice, and as someone who'd never really seen a glacier before this trip, it was pretty impressive. We didn't come much closer to it than 800 metres, but even at that distance, we could, feel how impressive it was. We were told it was about 1 kilometre tall, and later research suggests it's around 22 to 25 kilometres long, 10 kilometres wide, and covers an area of about 210 square kilometres. Looking at some of the boulders at the sea edge and knowing that they were the size of houses was again quite sobering. In the afternoon I visited one of the museums in town, the Svalbard Museum, before going to one of the restaurants, Vinterhagen. It's quite well regarded, serves local food in a very nice plant-filled setting. I had a 3-course meal with a couple of beers from Svalbard Brewery for about £75. On my last morning I just had a wander around the town, visiting places like the church and the sundial that I'd only briefly seen from the van on the first day. I didn't have a lot of time as the shuttle bus to the airport for my flight to Oslo left around 12:30. I had lunch in a cafe called Fruern. It doubles as a yarn and souvenir shop, before popping into the Co-op supermarket to get another t-shirt. I stayed in an Airbnb. Now admittedly I left booking until more or less the last minute, so the only hotel on booking.com was going for £300 a night, which, let's face it, would be excessive, but surprisingly not beyond my expectations. But there were fortunately a couple more affordable places on Airbnb going for closer to £100 a night. Given that travel lodges in Manchester are going for over £100 a night on the average Saturday, I think that's a pretty good deal. Visit Svalbard say there's 6 hotels, 3 guest houses and a variety of short-term lets, Airbnbs and the like. You can even camp, and locals will often head to cabins on the fjords for the weekends, with a small boat, a crate of beer and of course a very large gun. Assuming the closest you want to get to a polar bear are the stuffed ones in the church, the airport and the museum, all the accommodation options are in Longyearbyen, and most within a 10-minute walk of the Radisson Blu and the High Street. Mine was in a long 3-storey wooden block built on stilts on the side of a hill, easy to get to, and it had an equipped kitchen diner, bathroom and 1 bedroom. It was simple, but very comfortable. So, in terms of did I visit ethically? Well, taking these points from Visit Svalbard from earlier, A, to make a visit for several days. I was there for 3 nights, so yes, I spent a decent amount of time here. I could probably have spent 1 more day, but any more time after that would have been pushing it. B, choose to visit places with or tour with a company that has an environmental certification and are locally owned. Well, every tour I did, I booked through Visit Svalbard's website, so I'm confident that they were. And I definitely ate and drank locally, very pleasantly so. C, travel outside the peak season. My visit was at the very end of peak season, I think. It was just after the majority of tourists would have visited, and for sure things were beginning to wind down. Most of what I did was outdoorsy and required light, but I could have done exactly the same things without any detriment even a couple of weeks later. The only thing I'd have missed out on then would have been the midnight sun, but even that wasn't a must-see. D, don't only use motorised transport. The tour van and the shuttle bus were motorised, not that you have any other real choice to get to and from the airport though, and usually at least you're sharing with other travellers. That it was slightly shoulder season meant I was the only tourist on the Friday tour, which makes it a bit of an ethics balance. The boat was hybrid electric, so much of the time it was running on electric power rather than fuel, though obviously it was still a big catamaran rather than a small closed boat or a RIB, rigid inflatable boat, think patrol boat or lifeboat style. It wasn't the season for dog sledding nor skiing. Not that anyone should ever let me near a pair of skis. E, don't pick the flowers. I think I was very respectful, but then I would say that, and travelling solo means I haven't got anyone to confirm this. I certainly didn't approach any wildlife, even the reindeer were viewed in passing from a distance, and I kept to the roads and footpaths as much as possible. I think I did pretty well overall. Not perfect, but then no trip can be, really. Plus there's the question of, is travelling ethically to Svalbard ethical in itself? I flew in and out, for sure, but I'm happy that I spent my time there in an ethical way, and I have no problem knowing that part of my airfare goes to funding Svalbard's environmental provisions. So, I don't know if I really had that many expectations about Svalbard before visiting. I knew it was incredibly unlikely I'd see a polar bear, for instance, so that I didn't faze me. I'd have liked to have seen a walrus, but again I wasn't expecting to. I think those sorts of creatures are best seen when you have more time and go on a boating excursion to places a bit further from Longyearbyen. Maybe Ny-Ålesund, maybe a few days sailing around the archipelago as a whole. My main takeaway was how relatively inexpensive it was compared to what I was expecting. It's not a budget destination, don't get me wrong, but I had the feeling everything would cost considerably more than it did, given that it's a remote group of islands off the coast of an already expensive country. But the combination of it having tax breaks and life in the UK becoming less affordable on average...
'Cause he lives in it.
...means that it was, cheaper than I expected. It was almost like going to the UK. It was almost on the par with British prices, possibly slightly cheaper. That's quite telling and quite damning. I'm not used to taking group trips, and I tend not to do it under normal circumstances, but here it felt natural to do so. Normally when I go somewhere, I do things independently, because it's cheaper and easier, and I can do things at my own pace. But here, there's pretty much no opportunity to do that, mainly for safety and technical reasons. And going in knowing that meant I didn't feel awkward hanging around other people. Would I visit again? Possibly, but I'd go in winter next time to see both sides. I do think I picked the right time of year to go, at least for a first-time visit. As I say, people tend to come here for either polar night adventures, where everything's snowy, and you really get to meet your imagination about what life is like this far north, or midnight sun adventures, where it's warm enough not to need to wrap up, and you go hiking and boating without too much prep, and take photos without a tripod. I might be inclined to say it's nicer to be able to sightsee in the daylight, so that when you come back in the winter, you don't spend your time thinking, oh, I wish I could see that better, and you can just get straight on with enjoying the special experiences. I will say, unless you spend your entire time on endless trips though, there's only a limited amount to do and see in Longyearbyen itself, as a tourist anyway, so after 3 or 4 days, you'll maybe get a little bored. Julie also has thoughts from her trip, which broadly agree with mine.
I don't know if I remember it feeling horrifyingly expensive as its reputation. The flights were fine, the flights were cheaper than mainland Norway, and I don't remember being overly shocked by the price of the hotel. But I do remember there was an entire street of outdoor shops and the stuff in there was extortionate. You definitely want to take your own cold weather stuff with you. It's hard to compare Svalbard to anywhere else I've been in the Arctic or in Northern Europe. I don't know if it really feels like Norway. I don't really know Norway well enough to know exactly what it should feel like. But it kind of felt like an Arctic-themed theme park. It all looks real but not quite real, and then it's like you're on holiday and you walk straight into everyone else's everyday life. Everyone has a job, they have to by law. So it feels really weird to just walk into this working place and you're there just to relax. I suppose the best place to compare Svalbard to would be Iceland, because they're both cold islands up in the North Atlantic, but you can't really compare them. Svalbard is a massive wild place with relatively little for tourists. You're pretty much stuck with tour guides and guided tours. You can't go out on your own because you need to have a rifle, and the office doesn't just grant rifle permits to anyone who turns up. Whereas in Iceland you could spend 3 weeks driving around the ring road and then come back the next year and do it again and again and again. Whereas as a tourist, I think you'd run out of things to do in Svalbard a lot more quickly.
But hey, I got to be probably the world's most northerly Aroace NB. That's got to be worth the trip alone, right? Well, that's about all for this pod. Join me next time for another adventure beyond the brochure. Until then, remember, you are not a polar bear. And if you're feeling off colour, keep on getting better. Thank you for listening to this episode of Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tell your friends that I rocked your socks. If you wear socks while listening to my pod, that's your call, not mine. And don't forget to leave a review on your podcast site of choice. You can tweet me at RTWBarefoot, and I'm the same name on YouTube, Blue Sky and Pinterest, or you can find me as Barefoot Backpacker on Instagram, Discord and Facebook. Don't forget to sign up for my newsletter, and if you really like what I do, you can slip me the cost of a beer through my Patreon in return for access to rare extra content. Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure was written, presented, edited and produced by the Barefoot Backpacker. The theme music is Walking Barefoot on Grass Bonus by Kai Engel, which is available via the Free Music Archive and used under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. Show notes are available on my website, barefoot-backpacker.com. Until next time, have safe journeys. Bye for now.